we talked about the Declaration of Independence, which was written in 1776. Almost immediately, or it was immediately, upon the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the various states were faced with a twofold challenge. The first challenge was to create their own functioning state governments. In the stroke of a pen, they had lost their colonial governors. They had lost their colonial securities for their rights, and so state governments had to be created at that point. In addition to that, there had to be some sort of coordination created between those newly created state governments, and consequently, a document called the Articles of Confederation was established that was designed to coordinate the activity of these new states. I don't want to overspeak it, but at that time, I think I've mentioned the fact that it was never referred to as the United States is. It was always the United States are. They saw themselves in similar ways to what we might look at the European countries today. That they each had their own sovereignty, but under the European Union, these states would work together to advance their greater good. So this was in place through the American Revolution, and there were strong supporters. There were names of people. Patrick Henry was a strong supporter of the idea of the Articles of Confederation. Interestingly, Samuel Adams was a strong proponent of that kind of Articles of Confederation. But what really happened, and the preamble of the Constitution is going to highlight that for us, so I'm going to save that for a minute, but what happened in that 13 years, there were some positive things that the Articles of Confederation did, but there were also some very serious downsides to it. And there became a call for looking at strengthening the Articles of Confederation. Yet there were also some well-known names, George Washington being one, who said, I'm not sure that this loose confederacy is going to work adequately. We need to look at something stronger. Things had come to a head for a variety of reasons by 1787. We're going to talk about that in a moment. So in May of 1777, the convention began. They had been given the responsibility of strengthening the Articles of Confederation. But as the 55 delegates from the 12 states began to gather, Rhode Island did not attend. There was a growing consensus that the Articles needed to be set aside and a new form of government provided. George Washington was elected president of the convention. It was decided that where there were 3, 4, 5 members of a delegation, every delegation would have just one vote. They had to vote by state. So most of the delegations operated under the idea of majority rule. So they would caucus within their delegation, they'd come up with a decision, and they had just one vote per state. To prevent false rumors, they agreed that all the proceedings would be sealed until the last delegate died. Everyone agreed. I can't imagine how they did it. You couldn't pull that off today, I don't think. But they decided that none of their notes, none of the debate, none of those records would be made public until the last delegate died. And I think it's of historical interest that the last one to die was James Madison, the father of the Constitution. So to the very end, he was able to watch over and make sure that everyone kept that promise. And then he died in 1836. They made the rule that no delegate could speak more than twice on any issue until everyone had spoken. And then they could speak only with the permission of the convention. And for good manners, they agreed that all remarks would be addressed to the president of the convention. Now, we're not using the word President of the United States, although he will eventually have that title as well. But rather than arguing back and forth with each other, all of their remarks had to be addressed to George Washington, who served as the president. They knew from the beginning they were going to have two critical issues that could derail their entire proceedings. Number one was how they were going to create representation in Congress. The large, more populous states wanted proportionate representation. Obviously, they had more people, so they felt in some ways they were more important. They should have greater representation. The smaller states, however, did not agree with that. They wanted some form of equal representation. Roger Sherman came to the rescue with his eventual proposal for what we would call a bicameral Congress. Bicameral meaning two houses. You see the word bi, like bicycle, biped, and so forth. A two-house Congress. The second, and perhaps the 800-pound gorilla in the room that was on the minds of everyone there was the issue of slavery. At that point, the northern states, and we're going to make some very, very broad generalizations. I think the generalizations are factual, but I want to label them as generalizations. The North generally wanted to count slaves one for taxing purposes, but not voting. The idea behind that was if you took the economic incentive away from slavery and provided no political incentive, that would help to spur its decline. On the other hand, generally speaking, the South wanted the opposite. They wanted to count slaves for voting purposes, so they would have a larger, stronger voice as slavery issues were debated, but they didn't want them to be taxed, just like today. Now, many of them considered property, but they didn't want them to be taxable property. So eventually, what we'll find is a compromise that for the purposes of the Constitution, a slave would be counted 3 for every 5. Now, I say that way purposefully because it's called the 3/5 compromise. And one of the things you'll hear today, especially a criticism of the Constitution, is that, well, the African American was only considered 3/5 of a person. And I'm not sure that is entirely an accurate way to paint it. I think the compromise was more for every 5 slaves, they will be counted as 3, and then they will be counted both. They'll have to be taxed. You'll have to pay taxes, but then you will also have representation based upon the fact that they live within your state. The other side of that then was the slave trade could not be ended by Congress until 1808. That was a limitation that was placed on Congress at that time. What's interesting is there's kind of a historical irony here. The argument is made today, we'll see that the Founding Fathers really weren't that interested in slavery. They were willing to compromise away an end to the slave trade for about 30 years. What many people do not understand is that James Madison had a 30-year plan he believed would end slavery. And so at this point he thought, if we will compromise this and put my plan into effect, his thinking was by 1808 we will have dealt with the issue of slavery. Now we know that really didn't happen, and we had to have the Civil War, and it was up to 1865, and depending on how you look at Reconstruction, almost up to 1880 before some of those issues were settled. But that was the idea behind the date of 1808. It was almost in some ways a target date for having had this issue better in hand. They met through the end of June, or through May and into June. By the end of June, the convention had degenerated. It was chaos, it was disunity, it was argument, it was regionalism, it was partisanism. It was, at that point, looked almost to be a lost cause. It was on June 28th that Benjamin Franklin called for prayer, and we talked about that in an earlier lesson. Harmony was restored and progress began to occur. What's interesting, though, and to be honest with you, is that although Benjamin Franklin called for prayer, that did not happen because they got into the debate of, wait a minute, the federal government cannot establish any kind of religion or pay any kind of chaplains, so we've got to stay out of establishing any kind of state religion. So there wasn't prayer reinstituted at that point based upon that argument. But it did kind of bring people back down to earth, and by the 26th of July, they had hammered out most of the details that now appear in the Constitution of the United States. They appointed on the 26th of July what they called the Committee on Detail. They were to set about putting all of the final touches on the compromises, what had they agreed on, what was going to be done. And on the 6th of August, the Committee on Detail presented its work. The General Congress made final refinements until the 8th of September, at which time all of their notes, all of the agreements, were handed over to what was called the Committee on Style. And they were actually going to write the document based upon those things which had agreed upon. A gentleman by the name of Gouverneur Morris is who did most of the writing of the U.S. Constitution. He did it in just a little over 4 days. And on the 12th of September, he presented their document. Very minor changes to his wording were made. And then on the 17th of September, we had the signing of the Constitution. A majority of each state did sign, 55 delegates in all. As we get into our study of the Constitution, there are 3 basic parts to the document. There is the preamble, where most of us might have learned that somewhere along the line. There are what are called the articles, and then there are the amendments. When we look at the preamble, it is very short, and you would think it's more like a mission statement. And as you look at it, you would think, my goodness, how short that is for a document of this importance. But this is part of the reason why we looked at the Declaration of Independence, because this document was still very fresh in all of their minds. Most of them, and even to today, there are a number of scholars who say the Declaration of Independence is really the organic, it's the philosophical, it's the ideological preamble to the Constitution of the United States. So tonight, so that when we're done with this, you can say, I am one of 0.03% of Americans who has actually read the Constitution. We're going to start line by line, so you don't have to hear from me the whole time. I have my good friend Sherry Jackson, who's going to assist us tonight. And Sherry, nice and loud in your best teacher voice, the preamble to the Constitution.
The Constitution of the United States. I don't know why I'm crying. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America.
Looking at that very short introduction, there are so many important